David, he was just a love of life. He was so old.
He had a high concentration of salt in his blood, which eventually led to his death.
Who would believe that a mother will harm her own child?
On the 20th of August 2001, David Stocker died in the world-famous children's hospital, Great Ormond Street. He'd suffered a massive cardiac arrest 2 days earlier, from which he never recovered. The investigation found evidence of poisoning. Unusually high levels of salt were discovered in his system, almost twice the normal amount. The question for doctors and police was, who could have done it? And amazingly as it seemed, they had only one credible suspect.
She killed her seriously ill 9-year-old son by spiking his hospital drip with salt. Now, Patrina Stocker from Romford in Essex faces jail after being found guilty of manslaughter.
During her trial, the court heard how doctors were unable to treat her son David because Mrs. Stocker misled them.
Tonight, how a mother's love for her son turned into a fatal obsession. The mystery surrounding the boy's death and the shockwaves it sent through the medical profession. Patrina Smith was born in 1963. She grew up just outside London, in Romford, Essex.
She was a very happy child. She was never any trouble at all as a child. She mixed sociably with everybody. She had no problem whatsoever.
At 16, Patrina met Keith Stocker. At 19, she married him. And 10 years later, she became pregnant.
Patrina was absolutely elated when she found she was pregnant. Well, that was her life. It's what she wanted. She was completely overjoyed. She threw her arms around me. Oh, no, wonderful. We're just so happy about it.
Patrina gave birth to baby David on the 27th of March, 1992. According to relatives, she devoted herself to her new son from the very beginning.
Her whole life was David. Right from when it was mothers and toddlers, and they would sing the songs together.
David later attended his local primary school in Hornchurch. His teachers described him as a very active and hard-working pupil, while his mother became involved in all aspects of his school life.
They would sit together and do the homework and help him out with everything, and if he needed any books or if he needed anything to help him with it. He did very well at school, David.
To the outside world, the Stockers were a normal and happy family.
David's relationship with his mother, Patrina, was a good and close one. He was clearly very strongly bonded to her.
They were both two of a kind. They were both the same nature. Very quiet. They got on with what had to be got on with. That's probably how they got on so well together, because they seemed to know what each other was thinking, and well, there was so much love between them.
David was a happy-go-lucky and fit child through to and including his 9th birthday. He was active at home. His hobby was karate, and he had other activities as well.
He absolutely loved his karate, and he was very, very good. He did show right from the start a sort of a natural aptitude for karate. I really do feel that, given the chance, he would have come training probably 5 times a week.
David Stocker had reached the age of 8 without any significant illnesses. He was happy, active, and had a good school attendance record.
David was very healthy as a child. He was very fit.
But in late November 2000, David apparently fell ill. His mother wrote to the school explaining that he was suffering from stomach pains and vomiting.
David appeared to have a very ordinary bout of flu in around the Christmas time of the year 2000. Following on from that, he appeared to develop some abdominal cramping.
First noticed change in David around about January of 2001, and it really showed itself by David seemed quite tired and listless and was lacking his usual concentration. Normally, you only had to sort of tell him something once and he would pick it up, but I found I was having to tell him things 2, 3, 4 times.
David's condition deteriorated. His school absences grew longer and more frequent, and he became less involved in his karate classes.
David's father, Keith, did actually tell me at that stage that David was having a problem, that he wasn't very well. He just said he had a tummy problem.
In February 2001, David was due to take his karate grading qualification. His teacher and parents decided he was too unwell to take part, but David himself was very determined.
David actually decided himself that he wanted to do the grading, and he turned up on the day, and to be honest, I wasn't expecting him to perform particularly well because he had been very obviously unwell, and he actually put in an absolutely blinding performance at his grading. And I think in the years I've been teaching, if we've given out 15 distinctions, that's a lot, and he actually got a distinction on that day.
Despite achieving that accolade, David was frail, and just 5 days later, his condition suddenly deteriorated.
David was brought into extended emergency in Old Church Hospital on 23rd of February 2001. His symptoms were abdominal pain, and at that stage the diagnosis was constipation.
David was later discharged, but when his condition failed to improve, his mother Katrina took him to the hospital again.
He had 3 visits to A&E, and it was the 3rd visit on 1st of March 2001 that he was admitted under surgical team in children's ward in Old Church Hospital.
The doctors who examined him there realized his condition was more serious than they'd first thought. Acute appendicitis was diagnosed, and David underwent emergency surgery. But still, his health problems persisted.
On 3rd of March, he had his appendix removed. His post-operative recovery was not what we had expected. It was prolonged. He still complained of abdominal pain, vomiting, and the clinicians on the ward rounds found him very pale, lethargic.
When we went in to see David, it was after his operation. To be honest with you, he was absolutely listless. He had no life at all. He wasn't eating and wasn't sort of, as you'd expect a child that had had sort of what I thought at the time was a minor operation, you'd expect him to be recovering.
As well as being slow to recover, David was displaying another worrying symptom. At irregular intervals, his urine samples contained blood. His doctors were puzzled. There seemed to be no medical explanation.
It was the 3rd week of David's illness from the start, and we were stagnating with no diagnosis, and it was appropriate for us to call for a second opinion, and that's why he was transferred to Great Ormond Street on 14th of March.
London's Great Ormond Street is one of the world's most renowned children's hospitals. It was hoped that doctors here would find a cure for David after months of mystifying illness. But soon afterwards, David's condition worsened, and doctors began to think the unthinkable. Was his own mother, Katrina, to blame?
The idea was that somehow the parent was getting some pleasure, some satisfaction out of doing this to the child.
March 2001. David Stocker, an 8-year-old boy from Essex, has been suffering acute stomach pain. After being admitted to his local hospital, Old Church, doctors perform an operation to remove his appendix. But they're worried by 2 facts. His condition does not appear to be improving, and he's also producing unusual samples. They feel a second opinion is necessary and have referred him to the Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children in London.
David was referred to Great Ormond Street because his doctors at Old Church were concerned that he wasn't getting better. That's not unusual. That is the reason why a significant number of children are referred to us each year.
David's parents, Katrina and Keith Stocker, went with him to the hospital. His mother was adamant that she would spend as much time as possible at his bedside.
It'd be the same as any mum if her little boy is ill, and David was very ill. But Katrina was coping. She's that quiet, coping nature. She doesn't seem to get ruffled.
Most parents will come with their child to Great Ormond Street Hospital if their child is admitted. Obviously, quite often the father's unable to stay during the whole admission, but it would be common, indeed normal practice, for a child's mother to be with their child throughout the admission.
Katrina wanted all the time to simply be able to get to the bottom of what it was that was not leading to him making a full and appropriate recovery from what would appear to have been a relatively minor episode of flu.
But, like the staff at Old Church, the Great Ormond Street team soon developed concerns about the irregularities in David's samples.
One of them was that the urine sample contained obvious blood on one occasion, and then soon after didn't have blood in it. And that's quite unusual. Normally, if you've got a reason for bleeding from your kidney or your bladder, then there'll be blood in a number of different urine samples.
There are many conditions where blood will be found in urine. They don't always necessarily conform to a standard. After his appendectomy, a catheter was inserted into David. Using technical language, there was trauma, injury occasioned to his urethra. The result of that would be the discovering, as was, blood in urine, as happened in David's case.
On the 18th of March 2001, David's drip alarm unexpectedly went off at 6:30 a.m. On inspection of his drip, nurses found unusual blood clots in the tube. 3 days later, the alarm went off again. This time, staff noted a cloudy fluid in the tube. The following day, when the alarm went off a third time, small flakes of what looked like chalk were discovered. The medical team were baffled as to how and why this was happening. One possible suggestion was that someone had been tampering with David's samples. But if so, who? The nurses began to look at the possibilities. And it was at this time that the condition Munchausen's by proxy, with reference to David's mother, was mentioned in his medical notes.
Munchausen's by proxy is a term that we started using in the 1960s to describe children who were brought to doctors by their parents with complicated symptoms of illness which nobody could work out, and they would often go from doctor to doctor to doctor. The children would have test after test after test, investigation after investigation. Actually, there was nothing wrong with them at all. They had no illness at all. The parent was simply telling you lies. So that was one group. And there was another group who actually did harm their children by doing really strange things to them. Injecting them with insulin. You know, maybe the parent was a diabetic, so they had insulin at home. Injecting them with dirty pond water. Briefly suffocating them repeatedly, things of that nature. So those two sorts of things were lumped together as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, because the idea was that somehow the parent was getting some pleasure, some satisfaction out of doing this to the child.
The possibility that David's mother might have been tampering with his samples and drip caused the staff to keep a closer eye on his bedside. But there were other possibilities to consider too.
It's extremely unusual for intravenous lines to get contaminated. Just very, very occasionally there can be some sort of contamination, something wrong with the batch. And I imagine that the clinical staff assumed that that was the most likely explanation.
Gradually, David's condition improved enough for him to be transferred back to his local hospital.
David came back to Old Church on 28th of March. He was observed in the ward, and various health agencies like mental health team, physiotherapist, dietitian were called, and they got involved in his care.
But despite the presence of so many experts, no one could come up with a convincing explanation for what was wrong with him.
David continued to be poorly, his mobility was limited. He was able to walk with a Zimmer frame, and he spoke very softly, and he wasn't well. David's urine appeared to contain blood. This could not be explained, and his urine sample was sent to the lab for culture to find out if it was infected. And in fact, that wasn't so. It was normal.
The old church staff had already been warned by their Great Ormond Street colleagues that David's mother may have been tampering with his samples in order to produce the unusual readings. Neither team had firm evidence, but the theory was becoming stronger.
Gradually, the suspicions that arose in relation to Katrina Stocker began to ferment. That happened as a result of the observations of the nurses in relation to the samples that David was providing. It was not believed that the samples could be genuine.
One of the reasons was that he had an unduly prolonged illness, which could not be explained in spite of extensive investigations, and he been seen by various specialists, and all his tests were normal. One more important reason was that when round-the-clock surveillance was introduced, David actually became better in every way.
Over the next 4 days, the staff logged more strange occurrences in David's medical notes. His mother had presented them with a sample of his vomit, which they didn't think was real. David made a complaint that his Ribena drink tasted salty. And still more blood clots appeared in his urine samples. The old church staff, like those at Great Ormond Street, clearly had suspicions that Katrina was somehow involved. So why wasn't it treated more seriously?
If, as a doctor, as a paediatrician, you think a child is being harmed, or is at risk of being harmed, even if you haven't got proof, you've got a single duty. Your duty is to report what you know to the Social Services Department of the local authority, and the Children Act tells you you have to do that. It's then up to the Social Service Department to investigate the case. My experience in many of these cases is that investigations are inconclusive. At the end of the day, you just don't know.
It was hard for anyone to believe that a mother would harm her own son. But staff were coming increasingly to that conclusion. And so, it seemed, was David's father, Keith.
His father raised concerns about the source of blood in David's urine. He alleged that his wife was adding menstrual blood to his urine.
But why? According to Keith Stocker, his wife may have tampered with the urine samples to make it look like there was something wrong with them.
He later, it should be emphasised, withdrew that allegation upon seeing his son provide a sample of urine that had to have blood in it through a normal course rather than through any contamination.
But the damage was done. The fact that Katrina's own husband had made such serious allegations against her was seen by many to be highly significant.
Presumably, Mr. Stocker made the suggestion about his wife that she may have been contaminating these samples through the same desperation and frustration that she felt, that they were simply unable to get to the bottom of the illness, which of course was something they felt largely in common with the doctors who were looking after him.
After a meeting on the 5th of April, medical staff decided that David should receive one-on-one surveillance. Under a strict and watchful eye, his condition again improved.
David was allowed home on 9th of April. The consultant paediatrician who made the decision examined David that afternoon and found him happy, cheerful, and clinically fit to go home.
Oh, it was lovely to have him home. He seemed to get on well when he was home. One time when he was home, he was getting on quite well. He'd had his birthday and he wanted to spend his birthday money. So Mum and Dad took him out and bought him, I think, a Walkman and what he wanted. I think he wanted a camera. He's very interested in photography. They also bought him a hamster, and he got on very well at home.
David actually came to see us when he came out of hospital, and he was unfortunately in a wheelchair at that stage. David was really pleased to be there. He really obviously enjoyed the trip. I could tell that he did. We play a game which we call dodgeball, where we throw the ball at the children and they have to duck out of the way, and if they get hit they have to go and sit out, and we managed to include David in that.
But this happy time didn't last for long. After a rapid worsening of his condition in June 2001, David was readmitted to Old Church Hospital.
he continued to have some concerns with weight loss, feeling very weak, not being able to move, and becoming wheelchair-bound, and also complaining of nausea, vomiting, and pain abdomen.
It seemed to be a sickness that you never knew which way it was sort of going, you see, and then it was necessary, well, regretfully, we had to let him go back into the hospital because that's where the medical attention was.
The staff were shocked to see how ill David was looking. An old church paediatrician examined him, then referred him again to Great Ormond Street for further tests. And it was while he was undergoing them that doctors thought they'd made a breakthrough.
Those tests suggested that he had a rare and recently recognised reaction to a particular sort of infection, a streptococcal infection. Streptococcal infections are really quite common. They cause many sore throats, but occasionally a person will respond unusually.
Dr. Dale, a registrar at Great Ormond Street, was the doctor who finally came up with an idea to which the Stockers clung.
By this point, David Stocker had been ill for 7 months and been in and out of 2 hospitals. After the suspicions surrounding his mother, it seemed that doctors may have at last discovered what was wrong with him. But there were to be dramatic developments. Medical staff were to find out what had really gone on inside David's body.
Well, my first impressions of the case on reading the case notes was that David had been poisoned with salt. Nothing else seemed to fit. And what that will do is that essentially it will suck water out of the cells of the brain.
July 2001, David Stocker, now 9 years old, is in London's Great Ormond Street Hospital. He's been in and out of hospital for 7 months. And despite having an operation to remove his appendix, his condition is worsening. Pediatricians, dietitians, and psychologists have all tried but failed to establish what's wrong. They remain concerned by inexplicable traces of blood in urine samples. And there are suspicions that his mother, Petrina, may be interfering in some way with his samples and with his drip. But now the Great Ormond Street doctors finally believe they've found out what is wrong with their young patient.
David was diagnosed as having PANDAS syndrome, which stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorder, as a result of a streptococcal infection. It has a combination of effects, including affecting things like conscious level and mood, and causes various odd movements to occur. So it has a range of symptoms and signs. The clinicians obviously hoped, having pinpointed part of the problem at least, and starting him on treatment, that he would improve.
And that, of course, in turn, led to the obvious delight of the Stockers that they had finally found out what was wrong with him.
Petrina was very relieved. Obviously, she didn't want anything to be wrong with her little boy, but at least they'd found out. She was glad that they'd found out what was wrong with him, and now he could be treated.
Initially, David did improve and was allowed to go home. But the doctor's optimism proved to be misplaced.
And we had calls from his mother that he was unwell. He was losing weight, he was lethargic, he was vomiting, he was weak, and this time he was probably fitting as well.
With David's condition only getting worse, he was readmitted to Old Church Hospital on the 1st of August 2001. But within 24 hours, the doctors there decided he needed to be treated in London.
During David's second admission to Great Ormond Street, and when he didn't respond to the treatment which we would have expected to help with PANDAS, it became of greater concern, I believe, to the clinicians about whether something else was causing his problems, including whether the relatively minor events which we'd noticed before and had been noticed at Old Church might have been an indication that actually illness was being induced.
Once again, suspicion fell on David's mother. Was she somehow to blame for his condition?
it takes a long time for most of us, I think, to get suspicious, because what we're actually, if we do get suspicious, what we're actually saying is this person sitting in front of us, whom we've got to know over a period of time, and who presents as a perfectly normal, rather anxious mother, whom we haven't been able to help, is actually lying through her teeth.
On the 2nd of August 2001, the same day David had been admitted to Great Ormond Street, he suffered a cardiac arrest and slipped into a coma.
I visited David in Great Ormond Street Hospital twice, actually. The first time I'd been telephoned by Keith to say that David was actually in a coma, and that the coma was on a scale of 1 to 9. I think it was a 3, which is apparently not really deep in a coma. And I don't know whether he was aware that I was there or not. I spoke to him, I held his hand, and I just had a conversation with him, which obviously he couldn't answer or communicate with me.
David did come out of the coma, but he remained seriously ill and was unable to eat and drink normally.
David was being fed via a tube going into his nose and therefore required special feeds. When these feeds are made up, they're obviously not just a bottle of milk from the milkman. They are special feeds made up in our diet kitchen so that they contain the full amount of nutritional elements that a child of David's age would need to be able to maintain his weight and, if anything, put weight on.
Despite the feeds, David failed to gain weight. The nursing staff then decided to put him under closer supervision. This meant that there had to be at least one nurse watching David's bedside at all times. When his condition began to improve slightly, another suggestion was made: to move him to a rehabilitation psychiatric ward.
There were a combination of reasons why it was felt that he was ready to move to a rehabilitation ward. There were obviously concerns by that time that some of his symptoms were being induced, being caused by somebody else. And there were child protection issues raised, and the child protection procedure was followed through. In addition, David actually started to improve, and so the hope was that by going to a rehabilitation ward, then that improvement would continue.
On the 16th of August, the decision was made to transfer David to the Mildred Creek Psychiatric Unit at Great Ormond Street to begin rehabilitation. The move was scheduled to take place 4 days later, on August the 20th.
Mr. and Mrs. Stocker were obviously told of the plan to move David from the ward that he was on to a different ward, and they would have been told why that was felt necessary.
But on August the 18th, 2 days before the planned move, David's condition worsened. Both his mother and father were at his bedside.
I had a phone call from Katrina in the early hours of the morning. I think she was trying not to panic me, but trying to tell me to get to the hospital as quickly as we could, because David was very ill.
An examination by hospital staff revealed that David was severely dehydrated. Then, as they made efforts to treat him, he had a seizure. Further tests were carried out. These showed that the salt levels in the boy's body were extremely high. Normal blood contains around 140 millimoles of salt per litre, but in David's case the reading was 218 millimoles. Doctors were growing increasingly alarmed about his condition, and the efforts to treat him were becoming more frantic. As he began to lose consciousness, there was a desperate attempt at resuscitation, but he slipped into a second, deeper coma.
Well, when we got there, we realised how serious things were, and well, with Keith and Katrina there, we just threw our arms around them and tried to comfort them. They were so upset.
The next day, doctors faced two tasks: to reduce the excessive salt levels in David's blood and find out what had caused them.
We obviously looked at David's feeds after he collapsed, because a feed was going in at the time he did collapse. And when the feed was looked at, there were visible crystals which were thought to be salt in the feed.
Could these crystals finally explain the high levels of salt in David's blood?
There is no medical reason for additional salt to be added to the feeds. The feeds are complete and no added salt is required for them. Therefore, finding salt crystals in the feeds means that salt must have been added to the feeds by somebody.
Detectives at Hendon Police in North London were called in to investigate. Meanwhile, David's condition became critical.
I got into the hospital, and when I got there, David's grandmother, said to me that Keith and Patrina were actually in the office and they were being told that they were going to switch the life support machine off.
On the 20th of August 2001, David died dehydrated. Then, as they made efforts to treat him, he had a seizure. Further tests were carried out. These showed that the salt levels in the boy's body were extremely high. Normal blood contains around 140 millimoles of salt per litre, but in David's case the reading was 218 millimoles. Doctors were growing increasingly alarmed about his condition, and the efforts to treat him were becoming more frantic. As he began to lose consciousness, there was a desperate attempt at resuscitation, but he slipped into a second, deeper coma.
Well, when we got there, we realised how serious things were, and well, with Keith and Patrina there, we just threw our arms around them and tried to comfort them. They were so upset.
The next day, doctors faced two tasks: to reduce the excessive salt levels in David's blood and find out what had caused them.
We obviously looked at David's feeds after he collapsed, because a feed was going in at the time he did collapse. And when the feed was looked at, there were visible crystals which were thought to be salt in the feed.
Could these crystals finally explain the high levels of salt in David's blood?
There is no medical reason for additional salt to be added to the feeds. The feeds are complete and no added salt is required for them. Therefore, finding salt crystals in the feeds means that that salt must have been added to the feeds by somebody.
Detectives at Hendon Police in North London were called in to investigate. Meanwhile, David's condition became critical.
I got into the hospital, and when I got there, David's grandmother, said to me that Keith and Patrina were actually in the office and they were being told that they were going to switch the life support machine off.
On the 20th of August 2001, David died. His parents were told that the official cause of death was irreversible brain damage as a result of excessive sodium intake.
They were both completely devastated. We all were, and we were numb, absolutely numb, because David had been ill for so long, and just going down the whole time, and it was absolutely awful.
It was very, very surprising how quickly a little boy could go from even the situation where we'd seen him in the wheelchair to the situation that obviously we ended up at in such a short space of time. Yeah, it was very, very surprising.
The news of David's deterioration at Great Ormond Street and subsequent death was utter shock to all the staff, including me.
Keith and Patrina at that stage were just distraught. They were very, very, very distressed, in a state, obviously, of shock.
Patrina Stocker was devastated at the decline and death of her child.
But the high levels of salt in David's blood couldn't be overlooked, and the detectives were determined to find the cause.
I became involved in the David Stocker case when I was phoned up by some officers from the Metropolitan Police, and they told me about the case and asked if I could get involved by doing some analyses of samples which had been retrieved from where David was being cared for. Well, my first impressions of the case on reading the case notes was that David had been poisoned with salt. Nothing else seemed to fit. And what that will do is that essentially it will suck water out of the cells of the brain. And it also sucks it out of the cells of other parts of the body as well. But what happens when the water is sucked out of the cells of the brain is that they shrink.
The question was, how had excessive amounts of salt got into the milk feeds that were being given to David Stocker? And critically, who had put them there?
The concentration of sodium in your blood is probably at the moment around 140 millimoles per litre. Concentration in one of the bottles was 1708 millimoles per litre, a very high concentration. That's a lot of salt.
The feeds that David had were made up in the diet kitchen. They are a manufactured product and no added salt would have been added to them because they are complete in their own right. There is no possibility of that salt being added other than deliberately. There would have been no medical reason for salt to be added.
Armed with that knowledge, the police investigation of David's death changed. Great Ormond Street became the centre of a murder inquiry. The detectives leading the inquiry saw a pattern emerging. And it was a pattern that added weight to the early suspicions of hospital staff that David's own mother was involved.
Following David's death, Katrina Stocker became the #1 suspect because she had greatest access to him, because she was by his bedside as much as she could, consistent with the love and wishes of a mother. But that in turn, of course, raised the question, if she was being so closely watched, why was it that none of the staff actually saw her doing anything untoward?
We were all a bit numb at the time. We'd lost David and there's all this going on. We were completely numb. And it was about 6 o'clock in the morning. We were all asleep and there's this loud banging on the door. Well, I eventually got up. I could hear a lot of noise in the house. Katrina and Keith were staying with us at the time. You see, they couldn't face going home to a house without David there. They just couldn't face it. And we needed each other to help each other. And I remember getting up thinking, what's going on? And the first person I saw was Keith. I said, what's the matter? What's happening? He said, we're being arrested. And I just at the time, whatever for?
In September 2001, Katrina Stocker was arrested and taken in for questioning by police. She was later remanded on bail until the start of her trial in 2005. She had been charged with murdering her 9-year-old son, but her defence team believed there was little concrete evidence against her.
It was never actually seen, nor was it proven through direct evidence, observation evidence, that Katrina Stocker was contaminating her son's samples.
In Part 4, the trial of Katrina Stocker gets underway.
The ultimate question to be determined by the jury, which was who added salt to the feed of David Stocker, which killed him.
And David's death raises serious questions within the medical world.
This child had been looked after by different doctors in different hospitals over a longish period of time, and yet this poor child wasn't protected.
August 2001. David Stocker, a 9-year-old from Essex, has died in London's Great Ormond Street Hospital. This followed a mysterious illness that had seen him in and out of 2 hospitals for 8 months. But his death is highly suspicious. After the discovery that he's been poisoned with salt mixed into his hospital drip feeds, police are called in to investigate. Following a month of inquiries, they arrest David's mother, Katrina, and charge her with his murder. At the same time, serious questions regarding hospital policy are being raised.
This child had been looked after by different doctors in different hospitals over a longish period of time, and they had had their suspicions. They had reported those suspicions, as they have to social service departments, and yet this poor child wasn't protected.
It takes 3.5 years for the case to finally come to trial. The enormity of the investigation means police have to conduct interviews with 165 witnesses, and the different legal teams identify nearly 70 experts who can offer their own medical opinion. Eventually, the prosecution decide to pursue a charge of manslaughter rather than murder.
I don't believe that the Crown ever set out to prove that Katrina Stocker, during the months that he was ill and in both hospitals, was actually making her son physically ill. The suggestion that was being made was simply that she was interfering with his samples. The effect of that, of course, would be to hinder his recovery, which is somewhat different to making him ill.
On the 26th of November 2004, Katrina Stocker appeared at the Old Bailey charged with David's manslaughter. She pleaded not guilty, and her defence team insisted she was innocent.
A relatively large number of agencies were actually involved in the supervision of the Stockers. There was the nurses and the doctors and the police and the social services. They were all monitoring what was actually going on at the bedside of David Stocker. Well, under such close scrutiny, how could it be that if Mrs. Stocker was contaminating these samples, that simply was never noted.
During David's first admission to Great Ormond Street, there were concerns about the intravenous drip and also the pattern of blood in the urine. But at that time, it was thought to be the sort of thing that does sometimes happen, and no great weight was put on that.
One of the things you have to remember is that when a child has complex, difficult to explain symptoms and they're sent to a hospital which specialises in rare disease, one of the tasks of that hospital is to investigate for every possible incredibly rare disease, and that's often a very time-consuming process. So one can understand that one of the criteria was to say, well, let's be sure we're not doing this family an injustice and that there isn't some very strange disease going on here, and one can understand that happening.
The defence always maintained that there was no hard evidence that she had contaminated any sample, interfered with any drip, nor had she been seen directly to do so. If it was being suggested that she was adding blood, for instance, to urine samples provided David, how was she doing it? When was it done?
The basis for the prosecution's case was to start with the evidence and work backwards. The evidence was that David had been killed by a massive salt overdose. The next question was whether this had been a deliberate act, and if so, who had added the salt.
We did a thorough investigation, obviously following David's collapse and tragic death. And as a result of that investigation and working very closely with the police, we had no reason whatsoever to think that the salt could have been added by a staff member.
In a nurse's locker, sometime later, was discovered a container of salt, about which little was done by the police in order to further their inquiry.
There was discussion in the court case, in the trial, that salt had been found in a nurse's locker. This wouldn't be necessarily that unusual because salt isn't terribly available on the ward, so if the nurse had wanted some with her meal break, then she might well have salt.
By a process of elimination and a lack of other credible suspects, the Crown argued that only David's mother could have added the salt. But why? According to the prosecution, the decision to move David to the rehabilitation psychiatric ward, where supervision was tighter, had given Petrina the motive she needed.
On a rehabilitation ward, it is not normal for parents to be around the child all the time.
By secretly adding salt to David's feed, Petrina made sure he'd remain sick and have to be kept on a medical ward, where she could remain close to him.
Petrina Stocker, we suggested, at all times wanted what was best for him. If there was a limitation upon visiting in the psychiatric ward, and his mother was not happy about that, it was simply because she believed that she would be directly responsible for his improvement, not his deterioration, and therefore she would want to be by his bedside as much as possible. The prosecution said such ambition was sinister.
But if David was being watched the whole time, then the salt must have been added before it reached his bedside.
At that time, just like other hospitals around the country, we did not have a lock on the fridge that the feeds were put into, and we weren't using tamper-proof tops for those bottles. The bottles sat in the fridge, obviously keeping cool, until the nurses needed to give David the feed. When they got to that point, then the feed would be taken round to David and connected up to a pump so that the feed could be given down his nose through a tube into his stomach.
The prosecution was able to prove that the salt that was put into David's feed, causing his death, must have been added in the diet kitchen of his ward. At this time, there were no surveillance or security systems in place, so the culprit would be able to go unnoticed. And the culprit, they maintained, was Petrina Stocker. The jury was also told of a previous incident some years earlier where Petrina had been suspected of tampering with her own urine sample by adding sugar to it.
Petrina Stocker's defence was that she simply was not responsible for the death of her child. Namely, she didn't do the act that led to the child's death, which was the addition of sodium, salt, to the child's feed. the defence simply relied upon a lifelong and age-old assertion, which was that this was for the prosecution to prove by admissible evidence that she was responsible for the death of the child through the administration of salt. And the state of the evidence being what it was, the defence always contended the prosecution couldn't do that.
But the jury were convinced. After hearing from 165 witnesses during the 3-month trial, they returned a guilty verdict.
I couldn't understand how they could arrive at a guilty verdict. They obviously hadn't been listening to the defence. There was no evidence whatsoever against Petrina.
When Petrina was convicted of killing David, I tried very hard, and I think I succeeded, to keep an open mind and leave that to the courts.
The guilty manslaughter verdict had been unanimous. At the end of the trial, Judge Gordon told the defendant, "You will have to live for the rest of your life with what you've done." After 9 years with no suggestion of harm to David, there has to be some force, incomprehensible to me and most people, driving a mother to behave towards their own child as you did to David.
It remains a mystery to the defence as to who it was that killed David Stocker.
The fact that she was prosecuted for manslaughter and not murder means that the judicial system accepted that she probably didn't mean to kill David. David died as a result of what she did, and what she must be feeling now must be horrendous.
Who would believe that a mother will harm her own child? It's completely unbelievable.
Staff in the hospital have been deeply upset by David's death. We look after extremely seriously ill children, often who we can do little or nothing for. It's almost a greater tragedy to lose a child who was actually normal.
The case of David Stocker sent repercussions throughout the medical community.
Today, officials at Great Ormond Street Hospital have had to defend themselves from blame.
Great Ormond Street Hospital says the basis of our work is the child first and always. The vast majority of parents love their sick children. They want to be with them and to help with their care. Working with parents in partnership is central to what we do. Unfortunately, though, child abuse exists, and fabricated or induced illness, FII, is a particularly complex form of abuse to identify.
Great Ormond Street Hospital's internal review implemented 34 recommendations to improve security, staff training, and the protection of children. And the observation of a child should also include anything that goes into that child, especially storage feeds.
No one could see the pictures of David struggling to make a recovery in the hospital, chronically fatigued, largely unable to move his limbs. Nobody could look at that scene, whether they be defending or prosecuting the case, without being thoroughly moved. Equally, there was no more tragic a condition or position than Petrina Stocker being convicted and said to be guilty of killing her child.
Petrina Stocker was sentenced to 5 years in jail for killing David. After the trial, 2 further examples emerged where Petrina Stocker was thought to have fabricated her own illness. As she maintained her innocence throughout, we may never know what caused her to take the life of her son.
The whole karate group will never ever forget David, because what we did, we actually put together the David Stocker Memorial Award. The main one is Student of the Year, and it's on a big shield with David Stocker Memorial Student of the Year Award. And a different student gets it every year and their name gets put on the shield.